Okay, so thank you everyone for coming out to this event at this strange time, 9 p.m. On a Friday evening. Thank you for coming again to this event, Fireside Chat with Mrs. Setsuko Thurlow and Professor Naoko Wake from Michigan State University, hosted by East Asia Collective of Emory University. East Asia Collective is a student organization dedicated to creating a free space for students and faculties to discuss East Asia issues of social, political, and cultural importance. So let me introduce you to Professor Naoko Wake, who is an associate professor of history at Michigan State University, and also the director of the Asian Pacific American Studies Program, a historian of gender, sexuality, and illness in the Pacific region. She has authored Private Practices, Harry Stacks Sullivan, and Science of Homosexuality and American Liberalism, and American Survivors, Trans-Pacific Memories of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Her next project is the history of disability in Asian Pacific Island, Desi American families and communities. She was born and raised in Japan. And let me introduce you to our special guest tonight, Mrs. Setsuko Thurlow. Let us pin her. Todd, can you pin her? Okay. Who is a globally renowned nuclear disarmament campaigner and a hibakusha who survived the atomic bombing of Hiroshima on 6 August 1945. She is a leading figure of the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons and accepted the Nobel Peace Prize on its behalf in 2017. Well, I know a lot of you are really excited to hear her talk, but we will first start with Professor Wake's presentation to give us some context. In a brief presentation, what it means to remember the nuclear Holocaust, Professor Wake will tell us why it is important to remember the nuclear attacks of Hiroshima and Nagasaki at the end of World War II in 1945. Drawing on her forthcoming book, American Survivors, Professor Wake will focus on non-Japanese survivors such as Korean, American, and Canadian survivors and their troubled history, which continue to affect our understanding of nuclear weaponry today. Let us welcome Professor Wake.
Thank you so much for your kind invitation and introduction. I'm really excited to be here today, and I am honored to be in the same room, so to speak, with Mrs. Setsuko Thurlow, whom I actually wrote about in my forthcoming book, which is about Japanese American and Korean American survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki atomic bombing at the end of World War II in 1945. So my remarks will be really focusing on some of the findings I made in my research, but also because of the nature of my work that really focuses on non-Japanese survivors who were in America. Most of them are currently living in America. My focus will be really about global survivors, not just Japanese survivors. So my remarks will be trying to sort of show you the ways in which it is important for us to remember Hiroshima and Nagasaki, even about more than a 3/4 of a century have passed after the bombings were done in 1945. Why do we care? Why is it important? Why does it matter? For what purposes? So I like to say that the reason why it is important is because it reveals the human ability to destroy in both unique and universal ways. So let me explain both aspects. Why is it unique and why is it universal? I think it's unique for maybe some of the obvious reasons that people in this room tonight probably heard about one way or another, in that nuclear weapons are very unique and massive in its ability to destroy and kill. And also it has a unique long-term effect of radiation poisoning, radiation illness. This is something that doesn't get resolved or disappear or cured many, many years later. I like to say that there are many testimonials that speak to the unique ability of nuclear weapons to destroy. So for instance, artists Maruki Iri and Maruki Toshi in 1950 said this, quote unquote, "There is no one who can tell what happened at the hypocenter." And obviously the reason why no one can tell what happened at the hypocenter is because nobody survived to tell, right? Because instantaneously the lives were lost, the lives were vanished. So that kind of speaks very directly and powerfully indeed to the power of destruction that comes with nuclear weapons. Hans Morgenthau in 1961, about 10 years later, after Maruki mentioned that power of destruction, said this: "A nuclear destruction may be unique in that it signifies the simultaneous destruction of whole families, generations, and societies. Therefore, it reduces survivors to barbarism." I often think about the meaning of this quote, and every time I think about that, I seem to come up with different implications. But one of them may be that it's such a massive, comprehensive power of destruction that comes with nuclear weaponry that you can't really think about survivors in the society that they used to live in before the attacks. Whole society is altered to barbarism. So survivors won't be able to live in any previously known society, previously known world. Quotation is very striking to me for that reason. And I think we also need to think about how radiation illness is something that is long lasting and also something that poisons the environment in not only human bodies, but also surroundings of those human bodies who suffer. So this includes things that we need for life. So things like water, food, and soil, and air. And it's invisible, right? Radiation is something that you can't really see, you can't really focus on, you can't really touch it, but it's there. And you can't avoid it because they are in the elements that you need to sustain your life. And I think it, again, speaks to the unique nature of destruction that nuclear weapons bring to human society. So that's the unique reason why it's important for us to remember, because we have to ask why we want to develop, and we did develop such massive power of destruction that carries unique implications for human society. But let me now also say why it is important for universal reasons. And I say that because obviously Japanese people are not the only people who are destroyed by the bomb, but also Koreans, Taiwanese, Chinese, Malaysians, Americans, Germans, French people, Englanders, Hollanders, and Australians, to name a few. They were affected by the bomb, and many of their lives were destroyed by the bomb in either Hiroshima or Nagasaki in 1945. And if you think about the sort of diversity among the people who are affected by the bomb, you see that how the notion that the United States attacked its enemy, Japan, it's kind of dualistic view of who is friend and who is enemy, is accurate only if you look at the nation-to-nation level of history. If you look instead at people-to-people level of history, it is inaccurate and impossible almost to say that Americans attacked the Japanese, because there were Americans on both sides. The huge group of people that I studied for my research, Japanese Americans, for instance, were numerous in cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki as in 1945. And as you probably are aware, their family members back in the United States were incarcerated in Japanese American incarceration camps in one of the 10 locations across the United States. So Americans are both sides, literally, right? And 1 in every 10 survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki are Koreans, people from Korean Peninsula, who were in Japan because they were forced to be there by the Japanese Empire's colonization of Korea since 1910. And Chinese and Taiwanese people were in Japan in either cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki for the same reason of Japanese colonialism. And the prisoners of war were from a range of different countries, as mentioned earlier, in Asia, Europe, and America. So that's the universal part of the weapon. Because of the massive, comprehensive power of destruction that is unique, it also makes the destruction very universal. You can't just target a particular group of people, even if that was your original intention. That makes it, by definition, global. That makes it, by definition, universal. So I think that's another reason why we want to remember the nuclear holocaust as a unique and universal instance that we all need to be concerned about. Why did we decide to invest in creating such a weapon? Now, I want to say just a few things about race. I know, especially in an event like this, at this moment, it is pretty much on everybody's mind. It's on my mind too. So let me say a few words about race and A-bomb and survival food given the moment, based on my work. But studying Asian American survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki has made me realize the importance of race in our understanding of the history of nuclear destruction, something particularly important for us to consider now as anti-Asian and Asian American racism is apparently rampant today. I won't be surprised many of you are afraid of going out at this moment. I'm slightly afraid of going out at this moment. And it's been a unique challenge, even though historically speaking, anti-Asian racism, xenophobia, there's nothing new about this. So why am I talking about that? Well, I am talking about that in relationship to survival food because there is a connection. And let me explain you why and how. So some of the existing scholarship about the bomb has explored the question of whether the US decision to drop the bomb in 1945 was driven by American racism against Asians. And even though my scholarship does not directly engage this question, I do argue that the history of Asian American survivors shows how anti-Asian racism have importantly shaped ways in which they have been treated by their own government. Many of them came to Japan before the Pacific Wars beginning in 1941 as school-age children, in part because their parents were concerned about their offspring's future in an increasingly inhospitable host society of America. With a ban on Asian immigrants, that's back in 1910s and 20s and 30s, and racial discrimination in housing, education, and employment firmly in place, Asian parents were unsure if educating their children solely in the United States would be the best way. And let me mention a sort of similar example based on what I learned from my collaborator, artist Shinpei Takeda, about Mrs. Setsuko Thurlow. So to take an example of Mrs. Thurlow, she encountered difficulty related to race after she came to study in a college in Richmond, Virginia in the mid-1950s. Not only was her anti-nuclear sentiment taken as un-American, which led to hate mails being sent to her, she found that her prospective marriage to a white person was legally impossible in the state. She was engaged to a Canadian man whom she had met in 1953 in Hokkaido. The initial plan was that after graduation, they would move from Richmond to Toronto to get married so as to be close to her husband's family. Canada, however, prohibited at the time the entrance of Japanese persons without Canadian citizenship, making the couple's plan moot. Now they had to get married before they get to Canada so that she could become a Canadian citizen eligible to enter the country. Because marriage for them was not possible in Virginia, they had to find a way to marry elsewhere before going to Canada. So Mrs. Setsuko Thurlow went to Washington, D.C., where interracial marriage was permitted, got a marriage license, applied for Canadian citizenship, and finally crossed the border. The era's perception of Nikkei as racially undesirable defined a narrow path toward the goal of keeping families together and finding home. So the US government continues to offer to this day any recognition, apology, or support for US survivors today. And this has much to do with obviously the nuclear hegemony that America hopes to maintain. But this kind of geopolitical reason does not fully explain why US survivors have been so persistently neglected. The othering of Asian Americans as perpetual foreigners, meaning people who do not deem to belong to a national body, no matter how long that they have been living in that country throughout the Cold War, also played a role, I argue. No matter how serious their radiation illness may be, the notion that they are not quite American, Japanese, or Korean enough, 100% national enough, so to speak, allowed authorities to see their illness not as quite real as other illnesses on people who are considered to be more authentically Americans or Canadian or other any single national belonging. Furthermore, the emerging myth as Asian Americans as model minorities in the era played a role. Some of you might have heard that term model minority in the context of this recent rise of anti-Asian racism. But this has a very strong historical influence that we have to be concerned about. So if you can overcome racism by perseverance, the argument went of the time, you should be able to overcome any disabilities, including things like radiation illness. So I interviewed many US survivors, including both Japanese American and Korean American survivors. Their oral histories reveal subtle and yet very consequential ways in which the racial stereotypes made their illness, disability, and pain invisible to the rest of us. And again, the idea of perpetual foreigners and the model minorities really had a lot to do with how their sufferings are made invisible, leading to US government's lack of recognition of Japanese American and Korean American survivors. So I want to say, to remember the nuclear Holocaust is to fight against hate, racism, xenophobia, as much as it is to stay alert to both unique and universal harm that I mentioned earlier that can be done and that has been done by the bomb, and that can really deeply divide us. So with that said, I will pass it back to you, to the organizer. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Wake. Okay, so thank you again for providing us a very different perspective on the dropping of nuclear bombs, that there were other victims of other nationalities other than Japan, and also connecting to the event to the recent anti-Asian American violence was very relatable as well. So if the audience have any questions for Professor Wake, you can type it in the chat, or you can private message any of us from the East Asia Collective. We can collectively answer it after Mrs. Thurlow's testimony. Okay, let me pass it to Mrs. Thurlow and let us welcome her. I think you can speak now.
No, yeah, okay. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to tonight's program. I wasn't sure who I was speaking to, maybe to students and some faculty members, but now you have a professor from another university, from my neighbor state, I think, Michigan State, right? Yes. Well, it's so exciting. It's so special to me to meet somebody who is really doing the in-depth study of survivors and their lives. I am just delighted to meet you. I'd like to get to know you more and your work. I really like to read your book. Yeah, well, this is fascinating. Thank you. Um, I thought you asked me to talk about my personal experience and my thoughts. So I just pick and choose, okay? Uh, and we can have the discussion later on about anything which I haven't. So, uh, okay, I will read it. As a survivor, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
As a, as a survivor of the atomic bombing of Hiroshima, I spent most of my adult life as a nuclear disarmament educator and advocate, as well as practicing in my profession of social work. By sharing my personal testimony, I have attempted to put a human face to the often abstract discussion of nuclear weapons with the hope that such an approach would help people to gain a deeper understanding with empathy and sensitivity for what catastrophic humanitarian impact that nuclear weapons can inflict. Whenever I speak about my Hiroshima experience, the first thing that comes to my mind is an image of my 4-year-old nephew, Eiji, transformed into a charred, blackened, and swollen and chunk of flesh, which kept begging in a faint voice for water until his death finally released him from his agony. This little boy's image has come to represent in my mind all the innocent children of the world who could be wiped out from the face of earth at any moment by nuclear weapons. This image of massive death and unspeakable suffering of humanity has been the driving force for me to continue my struggle for the total abolition of ultimate evil of nuclear weapons. That fateful day, August 6, 1945, as a 13-year-old grade 8 student and a member of the student mobilization program, I was at the Army headquarters, 1.8 kilometers from ground zero. Almost 30 of us, no, about 30 of us students were assigned to work as a decoding assistants of secret messages. At 8:15 a.m., as Major Yanai was giving us a pep talk at the assembly, suddenly I saw in the window a blinding bluish white flash. And I remember having the sensation of floating in the air. As I regained consciousness in the silence and darkness, I found myself pinned by the collapsed building. I could not move, and I knew I faced death. I began to hear my classmates' faint cries, "Mother, help me. God, help me." Then suddenly, I felt hands touching my left shoulder from behind and heard the man saying, "Don't give up, keep moving, keep pushing, keep kicking. I'm trying to free you. See the light coming through the opening. Crawl toward it as quickly as you can." As I crawled out, the ruins were on fire. Most of my 30 classmates who were in the same room were burned alive. A soldier ordered me and 2 other surviving girls to escape to the nearby hills. Outside, I looked around. Although it was morning, it was as dark as twilight because of the dust and the smoke rising in the air. I saw streams of ghostly figures slowly shuffling from the center of the city towards the nearby hills. They did not look like human beings. Their hair stood straight up, and they were naked and tattered, bleeding, burned, blackened, and swollen. Parts of their bodies were missing, flesh and skin hanging from their bones, some with their eyeballs hanging in their hands, and some with their stomachs burst open, with intestines hanging out. We students joined the ghostly procession, carefully stepping over the dead and dying. There was a deathly silence broken only by the moan of the injured and their plea for water. The foul stench of burned skin and flesh filled the air. We managed to escape to the foot of the hill where there was an army training ground about the size of 2 football fields. It was covered with the dead and injured who were desperately begging, often in faint whispers, "Water, water, please give me water." But we had no containers to carry water. We went to a nearby stream to wash off the blood and dirt from our bodies. Then we tore off our blouses, soaked them with water, and hurried back to hold them to the mouths of the injured, who desperately sucked in the moisture. We did not see any doctors or nurses all day. When darkness fell, we sat on the hillside and all night watched the entire city burn, numbed by the massive, grotesque scale of death and suffering we witnessed. The following morning, I was reunited with my parents. My father left town early that morning. My mother was rescued from under our collapsed home. My sister and her 4-year-old son were burned beyond recognition while walking on the bridge to the doctor's office. An aunt and 2 cousins were found as skeletons. My sister-in-law is still missing. We rejoiced in the survival of my uncle and aunt. But about 10 days later, they died with purple spots all over their bodies, and their internal organ seemed to be liquefied. In those days, we had to examine every part of our body before getting dressed to make sure that there were no purple spots to assure us that we would live another day. We later learned that this was due to the effects of radiation. My own age group of over 8,000 grade 7 and 8 students from all the city's high schools were engaged in the task of clearing fire lanes in the center of Hiroshima. Many of them were killed instantly by the heat of 4,000 degrees Celsius. Many were simply incinerated, vaporized, or carbonized. Radiation, the unique characteristic of the atomic bombing, affected people in mysterious and random ways, with some dying instantly and others weeks, months, or years later by the delayed effects. And radiation is still killing survivors today, 76 years later. Thus, my beloved city of Hiroshima suddenly became desolation, with heaps of ash and rubble, skeletons and blackened corpses. Out of a population of 360,000, most of them non-combatant, women, children, and elderly, became victims of the indiscriminate massacre of the atomic bombing. By the end of 1945, some 140,000 had perished. As of now, at least 260,000 have perished in Hiroshima from the effects of the blast, heat, and radiation. And as I use the numbers of the dead, it pains me deeply. Reducing the dead to numbers trivialize their precious lives and negates their human dignity. Each one had a name and was loved by someone. In the aftermath of the bombing, people had to endure the physical devastation of near starvation, homelessness, lack of medical care, rapidly spreading social discrimination against survivors as contaminated people by nuclear poison, total lack of service by then the almost non-functioning Japanese government, the unprecedented chaotic socio-political condition caused by the sudden surrender in war, the collapse of militaristic social system, and the occupation by the Allied forces, and sudden introduction to a democratic way of life. General MacArthur, Supreme Commander of the occupation force, declared his goal was to democratize and demilitarize Japan. However, as far as his handling of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and survivors was concerned. His method was totally in contradiction to his stated goals. The occupation authorities established the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But the sole purpose of this commission was to study the effects of radiation of the bombs on human beings and not to provide treatment to the injured. Needless to say, the survivors felt treated as guinea pigs, not once, but twice. First, as a target of the atomic bombing, then as the subject of the medical research. The occupation authorities ordered some newspaper publication closed and censored media coverage of survivors' suffering and confiscated their personal correspondence, diaries, literary writings, films, photographs, medical research, etc. 30 to 33,000 items in all, and shipped them to the United States. The triumphant scientific and technological achievement in making the atomic bomb could freely be published, but the human suffering inflicted by the atomic bomb was not to be heard by the world. Following the massive trauma of the bombing, survivors had to repress themselves in silence and in isolation, and were thus deprived of the normal process of grieving and healing. With the return of full sovereignty to Japan in 1952, flood of political, scientific, medical, historical information suddenly became available, enabling survivors, scholars, researchers, and journalists to see survivors' experiences in historical perspective and global context. They became aware that the main motive for the atomic bombing was the American myth that the use of the bomb was necessary to end the war quickly, avoid the costly invasion of Japan, and save lives. The president's team knew that the Japanese military organization had practically ceased to function, and that Japanese government had made initial overture for a negotiated surrender, and that the unclarified status of the emperor in the in an unconditional surrender was the main stumbling block for the Japanese. With the report, excuse me, I think I need my glasses. Would you bring my glasses? Or maybe, oh, this one would do, Andy. Excuse me, I need my glasses. With a report of successful testing of the atomic bomb in New Mexico, President Truman was advised to use 2 bombs on Japanese targets as quickly as possible before the USSR join the Allied forces as they had promised. This was an important geopolitical factor for the US desire to position itself as the dominant power in East Asia in the post-World War II period. Another significant factor in the attack by the USSR on the Japanese military in Manchuria, northeast part of the China, forced a quick Japanese surrender with the understanding of the historical with this understanding of the historical perspective, the survivors then saw themselves used as pawns in the opening move of Cold War rather than as sacrifices on the altar of peace, witnessing the potential beginning of nuclear age. With the increasing realization of the significance of our experience, many survivors became convinced that no human being should ever have to repeat our experience of the inhumanity, immorality, and cruelty of atomic bombing, and that our mission was to warn the world about the danger of this ultimate evil. We believe that humanity and nuclear weapons cannot coexist. And it is our moral imperative to abolish nuclear weapons in order to secure a safe, clean, and just world for future generations. With this conviction, we have been speaking out around the world for the past several decades for the total abolition of nuclear weapons. Following my graduation from university in Hiroshima in 1954, I arrived at the college in the US on a scholarship. At the press interview, I gave my frank opinion about the US hydrogen bomb test at the Marshall Islands in the Pacific, which caused the islanders severe public health problems and environmental damage. As a result of my remarks, I began to receive unsigned hate letters. This was my introduction to the United States. The hostile reaction forced me to do some soul searching. I was deeply disturbed by the way many Americans uncritically and blindly follow the government line, justifying the atomic bombings. It was a chilling reminder for me of the wartime behavior of Japanese in swallowing government propaganda and brainwashing. It was a temptation to quit and remain silent, but I came out of this traumatic experience with a stronger commitment. During this lonely time, I discovered the writings of some US scholars with profound analysis of the issue. Such work inspired and supported me. One of those thinkers was Richard Falk, professor of international law at the Princeton University, who said, quote, The bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were viewed as contribution to the ending of popular and just war. Therefore, they have never been appraised in the necessary way as atrocities. They have never been understood as they certainly would have been understood had Hiroshima and Nagasaki been located in an allied country. Somehow, we got to create that awareness so that Hiroshima is understood to have been on the same level of depravity, and in many ways, far more dangerous to us as a species and as a civilization than was even Auschwitz. The failure to see Hiroshima and Nagasaki as atrocities, the regarding of those two 1945 bombs as good bombs that contributed to winning and ending a just war, helped the American consciousness to accept the subsequent development of nuclear weapons, thus linking the justification Hiroshima and Nagasaki and disastrous nuclear arms race in the Cold War. Well, something is wrong here. Okay. In the in reflection, living in North America as a Hiroshima survivor, Hibakusha, advocating for the abolition of nuclear weapons has been difficult. In the 1950s and even in the 1970s, I often felt like a lone voice in the wilderness, facing people's indifference, denial, justification, and even open hostility. But I have never lost the vision and memory of masses of human beings melting and agonizing for their last breath. And my burning city was filled with unspeakable suffering and inhumanity, without any respect for the sanctity of human life. No one can remove that vision and memories from my mind. No one can convince me that it is morally acceptable to use nuclear weapons as convenient deterrents to protect us from our enemies. Unfortunately, this military doctrine of deterrence has been the base for an ever intensifying nuclear arms race. There are almost 13,000 nuclear weapons existing today, and more than 90% of them are possessed by the US and Russia. The arms race is holding every one of us in the world as hostage with fear and anxiety, and astronomical sum of billions and trillions of dollars are being squandered away from meeting basic human needs. Even in the richest country in the world, the USA, dealing with COVID-19 challenges remind us how unprepared our governments have been in meeting true human needs. In spite of those years of frustration and despair over the stagnation of this hmm? of the disarmament effort, there has been euphoric moments for activists, like in 1982, when 1 million people from all over the world marched in downtown New York to Central Park, demanding the nuclear disarmament. However, after the fall of Berlin Wall, people went back to sleep with the faulty notion that the nuclear arms race was no longer threatening the world. Then, once again, 3.5 years ago, a euphoric moment electrified me at the United Nations General Assembly. It was July 7th, 2017, when the 122 national delegates voted to adopt the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, to ban and outlaw nuclear weapons. A vision I never thought I would see in my lifetime, literally was shaking my whole being. In the din of the thunderous applause, I found myself deporting to the spirits of hundreds of thousands of people of Hiroshima, whose lives were brutally and indiscriminately cut short. That we had finally achieved the first step towards the goal of prohibition, leading to the total elimination of nuclear weapons. On January 22nd, 2021, this year, just a few months ago, treaty entered into force after 54 nations ratified it and became international law, which prohibits the development, testing, production, stockpiling, stationing, transfer, use, and threat of use of nuclear weapons. This achievement represents the culmination of decades of tireless efforts by nuclear disarmament by survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, countless victims of over 2,000 nuclear testing conducted by the nuclear weapon states, and millions of citizens around the world. Those citizens groups, some progressive nations' diplomats, and international organizations such as International Committee of Red Cross generated the driving force to create the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. For the nuclear weapon armed states and their allies, this treaty constitutes a rejection of the existing global nuclear order and a direct assault on the doctrine of nuclear deterrence. Never before in my work for nuclear disarmament have I felt such a sense of hopefulness and excitement as I do now. Actually, this is not complete. I had to interrupt. I couldn't finish it. But I want to close by sharing the words of former President Obama. In 2009, I believe it was, in his famous speech in Prague, he talked about his aspiration for nuclear weapon-free world. In that speech, he said, United States is the only nation which has actually used nuclear weapon on living cities. Therefore, United States has a special moral responsibility to lead the campaign toward the nuclear weapon-free world. I want you to think about it as a citizen of the United States and what responsibility each one of you carry. Because the world look to you to take the initiative, to take the leadership to change this world. We are counting on you, younger generations. I have lived a long, healthy, good life. I'm close to 90, but your lives are just starting with a good education, good upbringing. You have the responsibility to return back to the society, to please make this nation a better place for your children and grandchildren to live. And thus, United States can regain the respect from the world. That needs to happen. Well, I may sound preachy at the end, but I am really depending on you, counting on you. Thank you for giving me this chance to share my thoughts, a little bit of my thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Thurlow, for sharing such a touching speech to every one of us, especially at such a late time, and everyone is so tired. I believe you as well. And thank you so much for showing up to this event and to share to 70 of us right now in the room. We did receive a lot of questions and concerns in chat, and also anonymous private messages. Some had said that there is a considerable percentage of Asians still believe that the Japanese people deserve the dropping of atomic bombs, considering their Japanese aggression in the Pacific War. They voiced criticism to Japan's emphasis on the status as a victim rather than a victimizer. How would you respond to that sentiment?
Excuse me. Auntie, would you get my hearing aids? I have hearing problem. I asked my son to go and get my hearing aids for me, but I think I heard your question. And many people in Asia feel
that the people in
the people deserved it, deserved
yes,
the atomic bombing. Well, that's pretty heartless thing to say, isn't it? Yes, I don't believe anybody deserve to be victimized by such horrible thing. Their lives are too important, too precious. Thank you. First of all, let's talk about Japanese military action in Asia was totally horrendous, and we cannot accept that, forgive that. Of course, I was a child and I didn't know about such horrendous behavior of the Japanese soldiers in China, for example. Maybe in the 50s, we started hearing about terrible things committed by the Japanese. And we were horrified. We were furious. We were sad. We were felt pain. We were shamed. I would say majority of people who can think properly felt that way. I do. I think so. Of course, even the good man, good father, and good husband acted badly. And then many people found it difficult to believe that their good father, good husband could have behaved differently. Where often war does that. In any case, that kind of barbaric behavior is not acceptable, forgivable, no question. And as when I first met you at the United Nations, we talked about it a little bit, and I gave my apology, although I was not a part of the military planning of your country, and your grandfather, I think you told me about. But anyway, still I feel a part of collective guilt because of their behavior. So 76 years after that event, if people are still saying that the Japanese deserved it, this is really sad. This is really sad. I think people around them have to help them to think things through and to urge them to do some reading, thinking, even viewing some of the films. There are all kinds of helpful resource materials. And we simply cannot wish death to living human lives. And nobody deserves such barbaric treatment, whether in China or Japan or Philippines, anywhere. Each and every life is precious to me. That's what one most important learning I think I did through the bombing of atomic bomb, because I have seen the masses of humanity just melting. And I thought that was so inhumane. No other human being should ever experience that again. Well, I don't know what else. I just hope you understand how I feel.
Yes, thank you for your comment. Life is indeed most precious things, and life of someone cannot be compared to others, despite being victims of Japanese aggression during the Pacific War. We also have a lot of questions concerning with the recent Japanese government's decision to release the wastewater of the Fukushima nuclear power plant. Um, this question is directed to both Mrs. Thurlow and Professor Wake. Do you think it might affect the global environment? And do you think that this is a sign that the government and politicians have not learned from Hiroshima's tragedy?
I don't think Japanese government has learned anything from us. We survivors have been speaking to them, reporting to them over 75 years. But they don't seem to have ears to listen to us. They have been hiding behind the biggest nuclear weapon states. And it's totally subservient to their nuclear policy. And really, we survivors feel abandoned by the own government. And that's really sad, infuriating. Now, about did you just mention about Fukushima thing?
Yes.
Oh, it's not awful thing. Yes, here in Toronto, we activists have been talking about it. Yes, and we are planning on taking some action. And we are saying rather than individual groups protest, it should be a united one. Anyway, that's horrible. And they say they have a scientific way of making the water harmless. Well, it's hard for us to believe, isn't it? We have been fooled by the government so many times, and we don't just take any words they tell us.
Mm.
You know, that's how I feel about the leaders of the nuclear weapon states. Nuclear age has been an age of manipulation, lies, and misinformation, and we have been fooled. And we learn we have to be cautious. Really, I hate to be speaking like this, but this is how I feel, how we feel. Yes, we have a lot of issues we're concerned about. Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Professor Walker, do you have any comments on that question as well?
Yeah, well, thank you. Just quickly, I think it is a harm to environment. And one thing that's very true about nuclear weapons or nuclear power is that we created this nuclear power or nuclear weapons that we don't know how to get rid of. Once we created it, we don't know what to do with it, even though it's poisonous and harmful to both humans and the environment. So that goes to show you just why government of Japan has decided to do what they decided to do in terms of the water that was produced as a result of the Fukushima disaster. I will say this, however, rather than saying that this is a sign that the government and the politicians have not learned from Hiroshima's tragedy, I would make the government prolong the governments, including not only Japanese government, but all the governments around the globe who still do possess and continue to create this power that's hazardous to humans and environment, even though we do not know what to do with the waste. So I think there's much discussion to be made about who is responsible for the act of the Japanese government, even at this time in response to the Fukushima waste. By looking at the different governments and their power dynamism. America does not want to lose its army base because in Okinawa and Iwakuni and others, because they want to have the place where they could bring in nuclear warheads to initiate launch or respond to the enemy attacks if it ever happens. So that has to be considered. So I would say the question really would be more rich and open-ended if it were governments rather than just one government that we might want to point our finger to.
True. There are a lot of countries in the world that is using nuclear energy, and a lot of governments, as cited by the Japanese government, that it's just standard practice to release wastewater into the ocean anyway. There are also Inyi who raised the questions that how were the survivors perceived and treated by other Japanese at that time? Was there also discrimination and ignorance?
Well, such problems kept changing as the time passed away. So it's not just the fixed answer I can give you. Now, let me see. The discrimination you mentioned, yeah. It was a real social problem at that time, especially young girls with rather unsightly keloid scar over their face and so on. They just could not step outside of the homes and to be bullied and ridiculed. And we heard many stories of that nature. I think many of those girls, were chosen to be members of that group, 25 Hiroshima maiden who were taken to New York. You know about that story?
Mm.
It was my own church minister who was involved in that, together with Mr. Cousins of Saturday Review, I think. Anyway, that social discrimination was real. And not only the scar, but since some women had the babies who were not developed properly, or microcephalic, small head babies and so forth. So people started saying, don't let your son marry the girls who were in Hiroshima at that time, and they could bring into this world deformed babies, that kind of thing. So it was a real issue. But 10 years, 20 years passed, and those women who were in marriageable stage at that time, earlier, have grown older, and they have already had healthy babies. So that crisis, I think, and they passed. So gradually, that fear of having deformed babies and so on disappeared. But the rumors that if you were there in the city, you suffer from radiation sickness, or all kinds of health problems. I met the couple who decided not to have babies. They could not take responsibility for the babies. You know, there were many couples like that, and that's a horrible fate they led. But it's my understanding that the social discrimination issue is not as overt. Maybe quietly, the, the issue may be affecting the people still, but pleasantly, so many survivors who refuse to look back and remember and talk about their experiences. As they got older, as they realized their time was limited, they started feeling, well, I haven't spoken because of such and such condition, but I would like to join the group of survivors who have been making contribution by sharing their memories and their thoughts and so on. So many people have joined to the group of survivors who are actively involved anti-nuclear campaign, or at least to share their personal experiences. Well, that's a healthy thing. If people can look back and be courageous enough to talk. I have well, let me give you one example. 2008 or 9, I was invited to join the Peace Boat. Do you know about the Peace Boat project of Japan? It's a passenger ship which take young people as passengers, and they go around the world. And as they live together for 3 or 4 months together, they learn a lot about the environment and the war and peace, and about any and every important issues. It's an educational program. Anyway, in year 2008 or 9, the organization which owned this boat decided to celebrate their 25th anniversary. They wanted to invite 100 Hiroshima and Nagasaki survivors to be the guests on the ship. And they phoned me and asked me if I would join them and be one of the leaders. I was delighted to join the group because for 100 of us living together on the ship, spending 16 hours every day talking about their experience on that day and in the aftermath and the following years, about their family, children, their work, and so forth. You know, no hibakusha ever had that kind of opportunity to meet with 100 other survivors and share their important memories. Many people just hid their memories. But for the first time, they felt the comfort. We felt the comfort in each other's presence. We could share our thoughts and feelings. And many of them were younger than me. And they said, look, I was in my mother's, what, in a mother's stomach at that time. I wasn't born then. So I don't know anything about the bombs. Or someday I was only 2 years old, so I don't know anything. And I'm not qualified to talk about the issues. Well, we talked a lot about that. And anyway, to make a long story short, by the time the ship was approaching back to Japan after over 3 months together, they could hardly wait to go back home and start a new type of life. And they since I'm a social worker, I carry the group session on the ship every day. I met with many other survivors. We talked about individual situations. And for the first time, they said they were able to open their hearts and minds. And although they never spoke before, but they could hardly wait to get back home and see what they can start doing. They felt badly they haven't done anything, but they will. So anyway, that experience changed their lives. Maybe I'm getting off the tangent. And what was the original question? But anyway, I'm saying something important. If Hibakusha had the people around them, people they can trust, the people they can count on, then they could have opened their mind and heart and could have shared. Then I think healing could have come to them much earlier instead of waiting just before 80s or 90s. This is an important lesson I think survivors are finding.
Right.
They needed somebody to ask them, to give them the opportunity to open up, to start talking about it. And people just avoided them. And okay, all right.
We only have 3 minutes left, and there are also people who wonder whether how can we actually devise a plan to effectively remove these nuclear bombs while also ensuring other nations honoring it? And do you think that there are any structures currently left in place to prevent another tragedy happen like bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki?
Well, I think we simply have to get rid of all the nuclear weapons which exist. As long as they exist, sometimes some people are tempted to use them, and that fear exists. This is why United Nations has been working through many citizen groups around the world. And not only the citizens groups, there are a lot of progressive nations which send the diplomats to the United Nations. And so those diplomats and the citizens groups like me, we worked together and we were able to work together very well. I think that's the only way, if the government and non-government organization work together. And this is the effective way to solve worldwide global issues. This is why this new treaty is crucial. It's going to take some time, but this treaty is supposed to complement and supplement the treaty called the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which has existed 50 years, but without any success. So the world were getting so frustrated, so fed up. Enough is enough. Those 5 nuclear nations, nuclear weapon armed state, United States, Russia, France, UK, and China. And those 5 nations made the legal promise when they joined the treaty that they would work toward the nuclear disarmament, but they haven't done anything. They haven't even started it. Well, those nations are very upset that the new treaty came into being, and they don't want to be part of this. So it'll be a difficult time before the harmonious relationship can develop. But how can I? Well, I think the people's way of thinking about nuclear weapons, far too long, I think militarists and the industrialists who could make money making the bombs, those people's power has been so strong, and they pushed out of the debate the citizens and survivors and so on. But about 10 years ago, the new movement called the Humanitarian Initiative was born. And the idea was, well, we should shift our way of thinking from old way. Old way has been that when we talked about nuclear weapon, it was from a technical, strategic point of view. They were concerned about national security, but our focus should be on people, human beings. They should be in the center and front and center of our debate and discussion. So shifting from militaristic way of analyzing, but more humanitarian consequences of the nuclear weapon. I am delighted because this is what survivors have been doing past 75 years. We don't pretend to be experts, militarists who can talk about the bombs and strategic planning and so on, but we can share what no other people experienced. And we can share what our convictions are based on our experiences. We simply share the facts. Anyway, that kind of argument is now accepted for the past 10 years or so. This makes sense now. And this is why this new treaty came into being. I am so grateful the time has changed. People are looking at nuclear weapon from different perspective.
All right. On that hopeful note, we have come to the end of the event, but we would like to take a group photo before we end. So if you can all turn on your camera and we can take a couple of minutes doing screenshots, it would be great.
What's that?
Okay.
Take a picture?
Yeah, we are taking a picture before we leave.
What picture?
I turn on the Zoom as a gallery view right now, so we can take a screenshot of everyone's faces. Okay.
Okay. 1, 2, 3. Again. 1. Sorry. Wait. 1, 2, 3. Sorry, too many people. 1, 2, 3. Okay.
Okay. thank you everyone for coming to this event. If you want to stay for a few more minutes, you're welcome to. And thank you, Mrs. Thurlow, to provide such a humanitarian view of viewing the Hiroshima bombing rather than the cold numbers we see on our textbook. And we hope that people in this room have learned from your speech and your comments. And I hope everyone can get something from this talk. And I don't know if you can see from the chat, there are a lot of people typing thank you to you. And also Dr. Carly from Emory University had commented that your church minister, if he was Mr. Tanimoto, he was actually a graduate of Emory University and received his ordination at the theology school here.
That's right. He was my minister, yes. He inspired us. He was a great worker. What do you students talk a lot about peace, war and peace and nuclear weapons?
If you want to unmute yourself, you're free to. Right now is floor is open.
I just want to know if these are popular topic for discussion among the students.
I don't think it is, unfortunately.
No.
Yeah, usually East Asia Collective open discussions for topics that people rarely look at, but important. Last time we had one on sexual violence, and it wasn't a topic that a lot of people talk about either.
Mm.
Yes. Mrs. Thurlow, I just wanted to thank you again for this wonderful opportunity that you've given to all of us to hear your experiences. And I just want to say just how grateful I am for the bravery and the strength that you've shown throughout the decades of your advocacy for this. And I'm just so honored to have had this experience to hear from you and to hear from all of you talk about this. And I'm just so grateful for that. I just want to thank you again for that.
Well, thank you. Who are you, the gentleman on the screen? I see the picture on the screen.
Yes.
Oh, well. Well, thank you so much for your words. Thank you. Are you the one who remembers my church minister, who's a graduate of theology from your school?
Oh, that was not me, but I believe that was Dr. Cheryl Crowley, who is a professor at my university, which is Emory University.
Yes.
Yes, I'm not important. It's the students who organize this, but some of them who studied with me may remember we talked about Professor Tanimoto.
Yes.
In any case, it's a wonderful thing to be proud of as Emory graduates. Many students are about to graduate ourselves, and all of us will one day graduate. So let us go forth in that example, and the example that we have heard from Mrs. Thurlow, Professor Wake, and as Emmanuel has just said, to be strong and to fight for our convictions. You really set a wonderful example. Thank you both.
Well, Reverend Tanimoto really inspired me, actually. He's one of the people who led me to the profession of social work, because after the war, out of the ashes, and thousands of orphans are running around, running in the black market and getting involved in minor crimes and so on, because national government was doing nothing. It was paralyzed. So the local city government was trying to help a little bit, but mostly citizens group helped those homeless children, because those children were taken out of the city to avoid the anticipated bombing. At the end of the war, those children came back to Hiroshima. City wasn't there. Their home wasn't there. Their parents weren't there. We had about 5,000 of those children running around. And you know, my church minister, Reverend Tanimoto, he was one of those adults who dedicated to look after those children, starting the orphanage here and there, all kinds of social work. So some people, even in the church, said, well, you're the church minister, you should be in the study preparing sermon for the next Sunday. And try to be critical, because he was doing social worker's job. But at that time, that's what needed. He did whatever he saw need to be done to help people. And he used to say, Christian faith without action is not Christian faith. His faith was always accompanied with kindness and action, supportive action. Anyway, so he really inspired me. I wanted to be like him and like other adults around me who were selfless in order to help other suffering people. So he was an inspiration to me. So I feel fortunate to have this moment with you to talk about somebody who has meant something in my life. I'm almost choking, actually. I would phone his daughter tonight and let her know that we talked about her father with the people at Emory University. I think she would appreciate that. Thank you. No.
I just want to say thank you again to all of you for having me. And again, it's an honor to be here. I have studied people who were in the same or similar situation as Setsuko Thurlow. So it's really an incredible moment for me. But one thing I really wanted to say before I'm afraid I have to go pretty soon. But before I disappear, I just wanted to say that when we think about preventing the use of nuclear weapons, it sounds like there's something that needs to happen that's huge and done by important people. But I think meeting like this, organized by young people like yourselves, is very important. The impact that you receive from the event like tonight's, organized by your friends and your advisors and your universities. So small thing stays with you and you carry it with yourself, and that's going to be the force for prevention. It may sound like it's a small step, but I think it is a very important step. So I'm again very honored to be here, to be part of that step. So thank you again for having me.
Oh, thank you so much for agreeing to come to our event. It would not have been this successful without you to give the context of nuclear weapons to a lot of people who may not even know about the issue. So the event has ended for almost 15 minutes. If you do want to say something to Mrs. Thurlow, feel free to unmute, or else
Can I make a plea?
Yes.
Yeah, I am delighted to have met your professor. I'd like to be connected with her research and her colleagues who have been studying survivors of Hiroshima. My goodness, what a delight to find such colleagues.
I will connect her with you later through
Okay,
email.
Okay, all right.
Right. Thank you so much for coming again, for all of you. Okay.
I like to have your postal address.
My post address.
I have some, resource material I can send to you.
Okay, okay. I will send you that in
Okay.
the email as well.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you.
And thank you, this gentleman who spoke to me a few minutes ago. Thank you.
Oh, you're very welcome. And thank you again for taking the time to speak to all of us.
Manuel Wooten. Is
Yes,
that
ma'am.
your name?
Yes, ma'am, that's correct.
What do you study? What do you teach?
Oh, so I am a graduate student at Emory University.
Yes.
I study creative writing in a field called bioethics.
Wow. 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 Thank you.
I also speak Japanese. Just,
Oh,
just
wow. そうですか。
はい、少し日本語の話せます。
そうですか。Wow. なぜ日本語を勉強してます？なぜ？
Yeah, so I've always wanted to study Japanese ever since I was very young, and I've actually a few members of my family that I learned that my grandmother had Japanese heritage, and she had a significant impact on my life. And after learning about that, after her passing, that's